Hi everyone, welcome to this interview. Today we are delighted to speak with TIBER brothers Ibrahim Sani, Luqman Haris, and Najib Aroff, who are the founders and hosts of TIBER podcast.
Thank you very much for having us, Charlene.
So guys, could you tell us more about TIBER? What is the inspirations behind and how it got started?
So to put it simply, is there are some things that we can't see on the news. TIBER is for that. So we have always maintained certain opinions, certain stances on certain matters. And on Awani, for example, we have very limited time, very limited space, and we're confined to the house styles of how we can report and say certain things and also editorialize certain things. So it's somewhat constricted. So one day we just sat down and said, we have much more to actually share with people, our thoughts, our views on many different issues. So thus TIBER was born. So it is something like, us sharing our raw opinions and thoughts, some of which or most of which cannot necessarily be shared on general news, on TV news, not just because of the house styles or constrictions, but also because of the constraints in terms of time slots and shows, etc. So is this just us pouring our hearts out, giving our honest, unfiltered opinions, and just us sharing, our 2 cents on whatever the news of the day is, which is, I guess, our passion.
Could you guys share with us what topics are most popular among TIBER podcast audience and how broad is TIBER remit?
The idea here is also to expound on what is topical and what it needs to be discussed. Sometimes it's not necessarily the same. Especially when you talk about critical items like new taxation policies or increasing the wealth of the B40 or M40. These type of topics are not normally discussed at length with an open-ended duration on air. So when you use these kind of topics and use our platform and use our personalities to extract these kind of conversations, then you're going to be able to get the maximum in terms of how we can engage the audience better. So I'll give you an example. When TIBER was formed, we talked about TIBER being technology, inovasi, business, economy, revolusi. And it translates directly into English as well. Technology, innovation, business, economy, and revolution. And of course, this is just a fancy way of saying, look, we know what is going to affect you, and we know what is going to change your lives. What we don't know is that how are we going to grow or curate our content to suit you. However, after doing this for the past 6 or 7 months, we realized that our audience is majority men, majority Malay men, and we are attracting the right side of Malay men as well as the left side liberal Malay men, but Malay men nonetheless. And while we do have non-Malay men listening to us, and that does form a huge bulk of our listenership, as in men altogether. And we do attract, non-men as well, either women or non-binary, to join to listen to our conversations. The topics that we bring about or curate, either wealth creation, politics, social culture, whatever it is, it sounds like we are catering towards the men that is listening to us. And because the 3 of us have different personalities, you're going to be able to see a lot of our audiences either violently agreeing with one of us or harshly disagreeing with one of us. So you can see that kind of dichotomy between the kind of texture and the kind of volume that we bring into our content. It does resonate well with all our men right now.
To answer it simply, what kind of content has always been popular throughout the 6 or 7 or 8 months that we've been doing this? I think the short answer is politics. But I think we've established a few times in the podcast itself that we do not want to be a hard politics podcast. I think our mandate or our mantra is just to talk about whatever the nation is talking about at that current moment. So we try to diversify our topics to whatever that is pertinent today, what we think is important for our listeners to know. So therein lies the challenge, because if you want to go for just numbers, then it's politics every single episode. Get a politician, talk about politics, talk about elections every single episode. But we also take that challenge, or we also take that, difficulty and turn it into a challenge in the sense that we talk about things that may seem unsexy to the common man and woman. We take that as a challenge for us to educate people out there. I mean, you're talking about National Energy Transition Plan, and you're talking about the returning of some taxations like GST, etc. This may not necessarily be covered in a simple and actually sexy way in general news, for example, whether TV or writing. So we take it as a challenge. We don't just want to share our thoughts. We don't just want to inform or entertain, but we also want to educate. So we hope that we'll be able to do this more successfully, not just provide good entertainment value, good content on YouTube or Spotify, but for our listeners to actually come out the other side after listening to every episode, learning and knowing more than they did before about topics that are important to the nation and also to themselves.
Over the past few years, podcasting has emerged as one of the popular new media, and we understand there are various mainstream media platforms that have taken a ride in podcasting. So how do you see the podcasting industry in Malaysia at the moment? And is there one fundamental change that you all hope to see in the coming years?
The podcasting industry in Malaysia is actually quite dismal when it comes to ad dollars. Let's do a benchmark. The best market for podcasting right now is in the US. Even in the US, you're looking at 400,000 total podcast titles that are published on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts together. And with that 400,000 titles, only about 10% is actually making any form of revenue. And of that 10%, about 1% is making actually quite considerable profit. We're looking at big title brands like Slate Money, Pivot Podcast. We're looking at Prof G. We're also looking at Wait, Don't Tell Me by NPR. So these are rather famous podcasts that have been around. The only thing that is differentiating them between another podcast that may have good quality, good sound, good content and the likes is that these guys are the first movers into the podcast industry in the US. Now, if you draw that back to Malaysia, we're looking at about 50,000 podcast titles in existence, 50,000 in Malaysia, but only about 200 podcasts is published every week, either on Spotify or Apple Podcast. Of that 200, none of them are making so much revenue to a point where it's considerably to be noticed by advertisers. But we're happy to report that at least in TIBER, we're trying to grow that podcast ad revenue, but it's not necessarily doing too well, largely because advertisers are not too familiar with the kind of content that is being churned out on this type of platform. That's why we use an multi-platform channel approach, where while we are sound first and podcast first, we use YouTube. We're going to launch video on Spotify as well. We heavily rely on socials like TikTok, especially on TikTok specifically, and IG Reels, but that's not growing too much in terms of traction. But TikTok is actually. The reason is because we want to make sure that people are familiar with the content and the brand title first before they can actually enjoy the podcast the podcast volume or medium, essentially, on the reason why we're creating this. We're happy to also report that we've crossed 1.6 million viewers, listeners combined since launching it about 5 months ago. And if you look at both at YouTube as well as on podcast platforms, Apple and Spotify, subscriber per listenership were higher than Keluar Sekejap. And we're still going stronger per unit basis. So while Keluar Sekejap does have the large amount of numbers, the number of subscribers per listenership doesn't translate as much as ours. And that shows one thing, that we have a deeply engaged audience base that really wants deep and long form content from us, but to try to change that into revenue is challenging. Now, is it unique to podcast per se? Quite not, because all the other broadcast mediums in the country is also facing headwinds in terms of growing their revenue, but more so for podcasts because advertisers are still trying to grasp the idea of trying to advertise or put money into podcast titles and see whether or not they can translate to change. It's still early days in podcasting business for Malaysia, and because of that, we are going to replicate what we saw in the US, which is being a first mover in creating great podcast content.
Are you guys open for PR pitches? And what are some advice to the PR professional out there who are hoping to grab your attention?
PR is trying to promote products and services. We're trying to grow audience. There is nowhere that is written that says that these two are not going to work harmoniously. Nothing. Now, it can be unharmonious in terms of working relations, but generally speaking, if both of us understand where we both want out of this, we're going to achieve a very successful partnership. So yes, we are much more happy to receive PR pitches. However, we have to understand that most businesses have boring products and services that not many people want to listen to. Let's be frank. Like if you sell, I don't know, a bunch of pens or a bunch of buildings, why on earth would listeners listen to you? So the idea here is to meet somewhere in the middle. Duration can't be that long, right? If you want to promote one of your products or services and you have a spokesperson that wants to talk about it, you can't imagine talking to us for half an hour about your products and services unless it's something that is so revolutionary, that is so interesting that you really need to get it off your chest. An example would be Tesla. If you really want to go along with Tesla, it is highly possible because there's so many ways to slice and dice. But if you have an FMCG product, we don't need half an hour. We just need 1-2 minutes at most, right? So, and by the way, people will still remember your product, right? If you have a Rejoice hair shampoo, that might not necessarily be workable in this panel because Luqman and I don't have hair, but there are 50% out there people that like your product. You just need 30 seconds, quite frankly. So let's be honest about what we want in this kind of partnership. And then let's be honest about the kind of content resonance that can be created from this partnership. For all the PR folks out there that want to reach out to us, please, by all means, I'm happy to receive your pitches.
I do want to put on record that I do have hair a bit. It's coming out. So you just have to be patient. But second of all, I think to add to what Ibrahim said, I would just like, I mean, this is probably easier said than done, but I would just like to urge PR practitioners out there to not just look at the numbers on the surface. Because this is a burgeoning so-called industry in Malaysia, the podcast industry, focus on the fact that there's a lot of room to grow. Because there are plenty of spaces for us to grow and in fact for other podcast channels to grow. So the old habits of PR practitioners and in fact companies and clients is that they're so used to seeing the hard numbers because they're so used on gauging engagement on traditional TV medium or radio. I've had so many cases where people are willing to spend more to appear on TV while not even knowing to the full extent the reach that they would get. Because I think for a number of years now, everyone is aware there is an open secret that I think TV numbers are quite dwindling because consumer habits are changing. No one is watching TV anymore, especially the young people. But because they're stuck with that mindset, and to some of them, I guess it gives them a sense of credibility. If your company or your spokesperson appears on TV, you're suddenly taken seriously. If you appear on some digital platforms and some podcasts, it's not taken as seriously as if you were to appear on a mainstream TV channel. It's these two things, look at the room to grow. Don't look at the hard numbers. Also look at the potential and also look at the higher ARPU viewers or listeners, because some podcasts or even some TV stations may have the numbers still, but whether they would bring the desired ROI. For example, I mean, channels on TV have probably tens or hundreds of thousands of viewers, but are they worth more than probably 10,000 of people who probably read The Edge or listen to BFM, or in this case, migrating further to listening to podcasts? So we may have smaller numbers compared to the legacy mediums now. And some podcasts, even if they have higher numbers, is because of their star names. I mean, Keluar Sekejap and all those things is because the pure star power gets them there. So we have harder work for us ahead of us. So I guess this is my suggestion to them. Look at the future and look at what's beneath the surface instead of relying on traditional parameters that you're used to when you're engaging or you're deciding to spend on TV or radio.
But this is a new form of media that you should consider for your clients and as well, because the reach, I mean, the way things are done right now and things happen right now, so different from old days. That's why both three of us, we are journalists as well, but we have this kind of platforms to reach out to the young market and all that. So I think PR should consider this as well in terms of promoting and also get their client on board. By just not looking at the numbers, but then the quality of the engagement and the eyeballs that you're going to get via this kind of platform, which is TIBER.
Could you guys share with us what is on the card for TIBER podcast in the coming months?
All the rival podcasts would now steal our ideas, our brilliant ideas. Basically, there's a certain element of actually introducing something new, which we always strive to do, innovating. But I think half of that is also us sticking to what's true and tested, what's proven. So there's no point in trying to change the whole thing too much to the extent that we lose sight, or we lose actually the original identity that attracted our listeners and followers in the first place. So having said that, we do have a few things in the pipeline. I think the easiest one, the low-hanging fruits, is just to get a more diverse panel of guests. Just by chance, actually, our first guests, I think 3 or 4 guests, were politicians, because we found the conversations to be very interesting, and the numbers followed, and the engagements also followed. But then, like I said earlier, we sat down and we discussed again, what is TIBER going to be, or what does TIBER strive to be? It's more than just a hard politics podcast. We want to educate the rakyat as well. We want to educate our listeners, because there are many more other important things, more important things than politics. We talk about the economy more in past episodes. So we do have a lineup of different panels who are not just politicians, but also titans of industry. We also have, even financial advisors. We have many other different types of people, because at the end of the day, to answer your question, I think we just want to give a more wholesome and holistic offering to our listeners. And yeah, that, and probably more big name guests coming soon, and probably collaborations with other podcasts. Wait and see.
That's one. Another one is, like I mentioned earlier, office hours, where people can just send in their voice clips over to us, and we'll address some of the questions. But the question now is on how do we ensure that the operations that we have right now is viable. And we've had so many comments asking us to do at least a twice a week show. To be honest, we'd like to do it every day, to be honest, because we can do things every day. That's what we do at Astrawani as well. We do stuff every day, 24/7 at that. But it's not economically viable for us to do podcast TIBER more than once a week at present moment. So if there are advertisers out there and PR companies that want to support us financially, this is a call out for you guys. If you ensure that we are financially viable, we're going to churn out content, not just for you and your brands, but of course for the wider audience as well. And that's why it's quite critical for us to look at content manufacturers, folks like us, and economic viability, because how often have we heard great content go out of business because it's not financially viable? Now, that's not something that we're trying to avoid actively. Are we doing it? Of course. We've gotten a few brands already signed on to us, but right now we're trying to also grow our product, i.e. the content itself, while remaining financially viable. So we're trying to grow that part as well. So we want twice a week, 3 times a week, whatever it is. But whatever it is, we also need to be financially viable. And that's something that we're trying to work with our folks over at some of our partners right now.
Besides hosting the TIBER podcast, I understand you all also have like a hectic day-to-day schedules at Astro Awani. And what's a day in life looks like for you guys now with the dual role now?
Well, as for me, I work at my work starts at 4 a.m. and then until I think about 1:30 p.m. where normally I would see Luqman because he's sitting next to me. But then it's quite normal. I think nothing changed because the recording would normally happen at night. But then the time for us to argue and thinking about the topics they want to do, that takes time actually. Those are the things that people don't know. The argument, the fight to get the topics done is quite exciting. And then sometimes 5 minutes before we record the episodes, we're still arguing about the topics that we should talk about. That's the thing. But as for me, I think it's quite normal for me because it's just that another workload. It's not really so stressing, but then something that I really look up to every week.
My day is quite similar to Najib. Usually we just have a tag whenever as I'm coming into the office, he's leaving. So I see him probably for 20 minutes a day. It is quite tiring, but tiring in a good way because now, our business as usual, our BAU work in Astro Awani is still there. In fact, it's getting busier. As you know, elections don't seem to stop coming now. We've got big election, medium election, now small elections. There's always something. But I see it actually as an opportunity to improve or churn out the next topic that I want to talk about on TIBER. So each day we submerge ourselves in news, perhaps against our will, because that's just our job. So at the end of the day, I would have at least like 10 topics in my mind and say, okay, I want to talk about these topics in the next episode. So it serves as a kind of like a sandbox. My day job kind of like serves as a sandbox now for what I want to discuss on TIBER. And coming back to what I said earlier in an interview just now, you deal with so many of these stories, political stories, economic stories, and social stories, what have you. There's so many things that you want to pour out. There's so many opinions that you want to give, and you can't necessarily give on Astro Awani because there's a certain time and place for that. So this is where we pour it all out on TIBER. So it is hectic, but I think it complements what we do on TIBER, and we're having a lot of fun.
I actually have the lightest job at Astro Awani compared to these two gentlemen. And I thank both of them for allowing me to, lighten the load at the workplace. But the way I look at it is I have a 4-quadrant kind of schedule. My role in Astro Awani, where I have to churn out Notepad with fresh episodes 4 times a week. I'm going to be launching one new show. It's going to be about venture capital. That's going to be quite interesting as well. And I have to help with the editorial direction of Negawani. So that takes about maybe 20%, maybe less of my work hours per day. And then the second quadrant is being a venture capital itself. I'm already an angel investor with 4 investee companies. I'm going to grow my investor funds to become an outright venture capital fund. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to close by this year. I'm in talks with the regulators, both Bank Negara as well as Securities Commission, to get this done. So that takes about 30 or 40% of my work hours. And it's going to tie up with the venture capital business. I'm going to tie up the venture capital business with the show that I'm going to launch at Astro Awani as well. The third is business consultancy and freelance work. That takes about maybe 5% of my work hours. Sometimes, when people have me for the whole day, then of course it takes the entire day. But if you prorate that against the work hours that I have per month, it does take about 5, maybe 10% at most per day. And the last is, of course, TIBER. Now, TIBER is actually something that I'm constantly working because we're trying to ensure that we get the best guests on. And it's not that easy trying to get the best guests on, especially if you want to talk to, say, for instance, ministers and all that. There's a lot of coaxing, there's a lot of pujot, rayu, all this. And therefore, it does require back and forth. It requires FaceTime. I do have to meet them sometimes. There's one guy that is an influencer. I don't particularly like the guy. Luqman likes him. I can see why he likes him. I really don't like the guy. But having said that, having him on is actually quite critical for our show. So yeah, having to bump into him every now and then is actually quite important. So that takes about maybe another 20% of my time. So that's how I organize my day. Oh, on top of that, I'm a dad, single dad at that. So I got to pick up my kids every day from school, send them over to their moms, have something to do over the weekend, run 5 kilometers a day. Busy lah. Busy.
Because we're not KJ, right? We can't have our pick of the guests, right? Because we're big and they're all friends and we have hundreds, thousands of viewers. So that's our challenge, but we embrace it.
Luqman, thank you so much for sharing. And of course, Najib and Ibrahim also for taking a time off your busy schedule, very busy schedule, to chat with us at Telum Media.
Thank you, Telum. Thank you, Charlene. And thank you to the good folks at Telum Media.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlene and Telum as well. Really appreciate it.
Take care, everyone. I'll see you next time.